Welcome, class. This is Dr. Pearly Rose Baluyut giving the lecture on the Prehistoric Aegean for our art history course. Here we have the map of the Prehistoric Aegean. On the left, we have Greece. On the right, we have Anatolia, present-day Turkey. And then we have the Cyclades, a group of islands colored here in pink, and a bigger island called Crete. This area right here is the Aegean Sea, and we are going to focus on looking at the art and architecture of the peoples inhabiting the Aegean. Here is a chronological table of the Aegean Bronze Age divided into the time, BCE, the location, such as the island of Crete, or the collection of islands called the Cyclades, Greece, the mainland, and even Egypt. You will notice that it moves from 3000 to 900 BCE. Crete has a strange chronological label, and it uses the letters EM, early Minoan 1, or EC for the Cyclades, early Cyclades. Now, bear in mind, around this time when we are experiencing early Minoan 2 or early Cyclades 2, we are already building the 3 pyramids at Giza. So you can see the differences, the activities in various parts of the world. By the time we get to 1000, we will experience what we call the Dark Ages. These are the Dark Ages that is different from the medieval times. This is the Dark Ages of the ancient times. And yet Egypt continues. So this allows us at least to move forward into our investigation of the art and architecture of the prehistoric Aegean, mainly within Crete and Cyclades, and a little bit of the early parts in Greece. First category, Cycladic art from 3000 to 1600 BCE. Marble was abundant in the quarries of the Aegean islands, especially on Naxos and Paros, which had supplied the Greeks and Romans. Here they found highly abstracted marble statuettes. They were seen as modern in the early 20th century because they resembled most of the Cubist, if you will, sculptures and even paintings produced by the artists of that time. One example is Amadeo Modigliani, an Italian painter and sculptor who moved to Paris in the early 20th century. Here we have a figurine of a woman from the grave in the island of Syros, forming one of those Cyclades sort of collection of islands. It is approximately 1 foot and 6 inch high. Now they vary in height from a few inches to almost life size, and so this one is a good example. If we do a formal analysis of this, we could see that it is very symmetrical. From the top to the bottom, we can look at the very interesting head, almost a triangular shaped head, very featureless, except for the very sharp nose. There is a very long and thin neck, which of course leads to very broad shoulders. The thin arms are resting on the stomach, folded as they were, and there is actually a space between the thin arms and the torso. We also have breast here and a swelling belly. Then we find a very clear indication of a genitalia, the pubic area, the vagina of this woman. There is no hips, but definitely everything tapers to very thin legs and feet. And there's also that daring space there, making this sculpture even more vulnerable to damage. And indeed, there are cracks already here. Now, this is a typical figure, flat, schematized body, using large, simple triangles that dominate the form. Details are incised, but people are still debating if these are funerary offerings because they must have been placed in the grave lying down like the dead, because the feet are too fragile to support it as a freestanding sculpture. Yes, indeed, I would probably agree with that too. This is very small, and if you try to make it stand, it's going to tip over. So perhaps the belief that these statuettes were buried in the grave, lying down, would conform with the deceased also in the similar state. Now, even though these are made of marble, traces of paint actually appeared even in places like eyes and mouths. Some statuettes actually have red and blue necklaces and even bracelets, and they are painted by dots on the cheeks, and we will see some actually bearing this paint. But for now, this is a very good example of the Cycladic art found around 2500 BCE, and also showing us the kind of expertise, the kind of aesthetics of the artists during that time. Now, in terms of interpretation, we might think, well, because she is holding her belly or resting her arms on her belly, that this could be a figure of fertility, a goddess of fertility. She might be pregnant. We can only interpret because we've seen other objects like the nude woman, the Venus of Willendorf, for example, in the art of the Stone Age. But definitely there is attention to details despite the faceless sort of appearance. We know that it is a full figure, a full human figure, buried in the grave in the island of Cyrus. Here is another example of a statuette made of marble, and you can see the convention among the Cycladic art produced during that time, with an almost triangular shape for a head, no eyes, but very sharp nose. Again, the neck. This time it's not a broad shoulder, but the hands are again placed on the stomach. And we find the genitalia indicated again, a much thicker thigh, and also sort of thicker legs. This, of course, would have been placed on the ground, lying down, not on its feet. Besides the female figurines, male figures also occur in the Cycladic repertoire. And musicians are well represented. And here is an example of a male lyre player from Kyros in the Cyclades dating to 2500 BCE. Again, made of marble, but only 9 inches high. It bears a few cracks already, so there's a bit of restoration done here. We are also missing a bit of the pieces. So we can appreciate now from the side view how this figure stands in front of us in terms of its presence. Although it's seated here, he is doing a very important function. He is playing for the deceased in the afterlife, although scholars cannot agree. Again, this particular sculpture reflects a preference for simple geometric shapes. You can see the very interesting shape from the side view of the head and the very sharp, almost triangular nose. Again, a triangle is seen here and all the other shapes here. What is interesting is the sculptor is again very daring. opening up this space by creating a hole, and thus, of course, subjecting this sculpture to damage. Some people think that this might be a prized possession. The harp itself has a duck bill or swan head ornament at the apex of the soundbacks. But with the absence of written documents at this time, scholars cannot be sure in terms of the meaning of this figurine, some of which were found in the settlements rather than cemeteries. We only have a few examples of Cycladic art, so we now move to Minoan art, circa 3000 to 1000 BCE. Many scholars have devised chronologies, particularly for the Minoan culture. Some of these chronologies are very, very detailed and are based on certain evidences. For example, we have the tripartite system developed by Sir Arthur Evans, and he divides Minoan art into the chronology of the early Minoan period, the middle, and the late Minoan period. The palatial system is also another form of chronology based on the palaces that were built. So, in this system, we would call a particular time period as pre-palatial, proto-palatial, old palace, neo-palatial, and new palace, post-palatial. When you combine all the Minoan chronologies available to us, we will see that it is very detailed. And here we've got some dates. We've got the pre-palatial here under the palatial system. And intersecting are the other kinds of chronologies, including early Minoan one or middle Minoan one, etc., all the way down to the 1000 BCE. Of course, this is too specialized, but it gives us an idea of how different certain individuals have conceived time in relation to Minoan culture and history. The sea-dominated geography of the Aegean and temperate climate contrast sharply with that of the Near East. Crete, where Minoan culture flourished, was part of a commercial crossroad in the ancient Mediterranean. And so it was very important to look at this from various levels, not just cultural, but economic and political. The sea around Crete provided a natural defense against invasions. And so we're looking at the Minoans in Crete. But in order to do so, we need to ask, who are the Minoans? Well, the Minoans is a cultural, not ethnic designation. It refers to the Bronze Age people who lived on the island of Crete and to the language they spoke. It is considered the first European civilization and is often seen as the ancestors of the Greeks. So, very, very important group of people. Archaeologists found many documents written in scripts dubbed Linear A and Linear B. Linear B can now be read, and schools have begun to reconstruct Aegean civilization by referring to contemporary records and not just to Homer's heroic account. The Minoan writing systems consisted of hieroglyphic A, hieroglyphic B, which has been deciphered as an early form of Greek, and linear A syllabary made of picture signs, and linear B syllabary of a decimal system. All this contributes to the increased knowledge about the Minoans in Crete. According to legend, the Minoans trace themselves to King Minos of Knossos. Zeus connected with Europa and they bore sons, including Minos or Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Sarpedon. King Minos ruled Knossos and built a palace, and Knossos is in Crete. He had a daughter named Ariadne, and Ariadne had a suitor named Theseus. And we are going to learn more about Theseus and his role in slaying the Minotaur inside a labyrinth. Here you can see a family tree or a genealogy, the Royal House of Thebes, and we will find, circle in red, Minos or Minos and Ariadne, and we can see Theseus. Now, in addition to this, you might have seen a bit of a recurrence. We mentioned Zeus and Europa got together and had three sons. Two of them are actually noted here. But Zeus also appears in various places. In short, Zeus gets to sleep around and he is able to produce many heirs, and so spinning more tales and legends about the gods and the goddesses. In the study of Minoan art, Sir Arthur John Evans's name comes up. He devoted almost all his life as an archaeologist to the discovery of the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete. This British uncovered a palace that indeed resembled a maze and named for the people of this place, the Minoans, after their mythological king, King Minos. Sir Arthur John Evans' initial findings were soon augmented by additional excavations at Phaistos, Hagia Triada, and other sites. Here he is shown in 1936 after he had completed his field work. Like other cultures, religion is of utmost importance, and two primary religious icons dominate Minoan architecture and art. And we will find this actually in the succeeding examples. One of them includes this particular shape, which we call the labrys or the double axe. The second one, which Arthur Evans named the horns of consecration, includes this. It resembles the horns of a bull, and oftentimes they are placed on the roof, on top of a building, and you can see a series of those horns. Between the labrys or the double axe and the horns of consecration, we will have a greater appreciation of the works of art and architecture on the island of Crete. The horns of consecration is a very special religious icon. When it is placed on top, it actually frames the rising sun from the east, rising above a mountain. Here are examples where the horns of consecrations are placed within the architecture. Here is a series of those horns of consecration. The other religious icon is the labrys, or what we call the double axe. Often it is believed among archaeologists and historians that the Minoans would select a particular spot and then plant the labrys on the ground and wait for the sun to strike. The shadow that it makes based on the labyrinth provides them with the axis that is north and south and east and west. Indeed, the labyrinth as a religious icon also served a practical purpose as a sighting pole. When the double axe is placed on a particular location and the sun hits it and creates a shadow, they are able to produce sort of axis, and this is called an axis mundi, created by the double axe grid. Sometimes it is seen as essential in mapping certain locations before they build palaces or other kinds of structure. During 3000 BCE, the settlements on the Aegean islands in Greek mainland were small and consisted only of simple buildings. In contrast, in 2000 BCE, this period was marked by a construction of palaces in Crete. The first period of palace building, however, came to an abrupt end around 1700 BCE because of an earthquake. The rebuilding of the palace, called New Palace period, occurred and is now known as the Golden Age of Crete, an era when the first great Western civilization emerged. Here we are looking at the palace at Knossos in the island of Crete, dating to circa 1700 to 1400 BCE. We are looking at a general view on a hill. It is said, according to legend, that the palace at Knossos was the home of the legendary King Minos or Minos. Now let's try to wrap this up. King Minos of Knossos was a legendary figure, said to have extracted from Athens a tribute of youths and maiden, to be fed to the Minotaur, a creature that is half bull and half man, housed in a vast labyrinth. Now, Arthur Evans, the British archaeologist, believed that the Palace of Knossos was a labyrinth in itself. In fact, the Minoan word labrys, Labrys, is the origin of the word labyrinthos. And in English, this etymology contributed to the rise of the noun called labyrinth. And we know when we call a labyrinth, it's like a maze. But in the legend, many people believed that the maze or any architecture or any fantastic work of art was designed by this mythical Daedalus. And it was said in the legend that it was Daedalus who actually built this maze for King Minos or Minos of Crete. And that this maze or labyrinth is the place that confined the Minotaur for eternity. And so we have the palace at Knossos braiding the legend, the mythology. And we know that the maze-like floor plan somehow coincides with the labrys or the double axe, which becomes the word labyrinth. Indeed, there is an important legend here because it is said that Theseus was said to have battled with a bullman minotaur. According to the myth, King Minos of the palace of Knossos demanded all the suitors of his daughter Ariadne to go inside the labyrinth. By going inside the labyrinth, they are ordered to kill the Minotaur if they could. However, many suitors who entered the labyrinth couldn't make their way back, and so they died inside the labyrinth. Theseus, however, was lucky because Ariadne told him that before he enters the labyrinth, he should carry a cord and tie it. And then, as he makes his way into the maze, like labyrinth, is still connected to the very entrance. And so he did. And when he got in, he looked for the Minotaur, the half bull, half man, and killed him. And on his way back, he simply just followed the cord until it led him to the entrance. The maze-like complexity of the Palace of Knossos strengthens the myth about Theseus, the Minotaur, and the sacrificial slaughter. Here we have the floor plan at the Palace of Knossos, derived as the home of King Minos. This palace was a rambling structure built against the upper slopes and across the top of a low hill that rises from a fertile plain. All around the palace proper were the mansions and villas of the Minoan elite. But in this palace, we see a great rectangular court, which was leveled during the old palace period, and the newly rebuilt palace was carefully planned. In the legend on the right, you will see the various rooms. Besides that courtyard, we find a throne room for number 9, and also a grand staircase, for example, for number 12. And finally, a very important one, the magazines, which is this location. Magazines are actually storage areas so that they could keep their grains and other food supplies intact. One of the most interesting parts here is also the Queen's Megaron, which you see here in number 16. Overall, it's a very interesting floor plan for a palace, and certainly it delivers the sort of belief about the myth of King Minos and the legend of the double axe or the labyrinth that gave birth to the labyrinth. The Palace of Knossos contained magazines or storage areas, and within those storage areas are pithos or large jars. And you can see the size of those jars, and they might contain grains, olive oil, and other food supplies. Besides the industrial accommodations, there is a residential accommodation. Now, the Palace of Knossos was constructed with thick walls of rough unshaped fieldstones embedded in a clay. Ashlar masonry was used at building corners and around door and window openings. And interestingly, terracotta pipes under the building serve as an efficient drainage system for rainwater. So they were quite advanced, the Minoans. The plan has a very complex elevation. It had many stories, as 3 around the central court, interior staircases built around light and air wells for illumination and ventilation. And the Minoan columns were painted, which were originally fashioned in wood. Most of these columns were heavily restored by Sir Arthur John Evans in stones, and they are bulbous-like in construction. It looks like there is a cushion on top as a capital, resembling the reversal of typical columns. And then you see here the red shaft of the column, and it tapers into this very narrow base, complete opposite of what we've seen in the Egyptian columns. So the Minoans, in terms of their residential accommodations, are quite comfortable. They have plenty of natural lighting, they have air. They also were able to get rid of their waste through a sewer um, made of terracotta pipes. So quite advanced. Now, besides architecture, Minoan painting is also a very interesting area of examination. Frescoes or mural paintings adorn the Palace of Knossos, and many of these paintings depict the many scenes of Minoan life. La Parisienne, which you see here, or a Minoan woman or goddess, because people cannot be sure, was found in the Palace of Knossos. It's a fragment of a fresco or a wall painting, which was approximately 10-inch high. The name is called La Parisienne because of its elegant dress, elaborate coiffure, and full rouge lips like an impressionist lady. Again, many of the people seeing this when they discover this painting are projecting their own cultural biases and knowledge of art history, particularly 19th century French art history and style called Impressionism. So now she is called La Parisienne. This is a figure of a woman painted as a wall painting that is in profile view with very curly hair, long and braided. She has big eyes and she has red lips. And she is wearing a very heavily decorated dress and various colors. She is a conventional representation judging from the oversized eyes in profile. Unlike the Egyptian who used the dry fresco method, the Minoans coated the rough fabric of their rubble walls with a fine white lime plaster and used what we would call a true or wet fresco method. This requires execution of great skill to finish the fresco faster before it dries. We're going to talk more about the difference between wet and dry fresco later, but here is a very good example of Minoan painting in an image of a woman. Another fresco is the Bull Leaping from the palace at Knossos, dating to circa 1450 BCE. Now, this is heavily restored, as you can see here, but it presents the liveliness and spontaneity of the Minoan ceremony of bull leaping. The convention shows young women painted with fair skin, men with red skin, pinch waist, and are highly animated. They have long curly hair. The curving lines suggest elasticity of the living and moving being. Now, this is a sport. Holding the bull's horns, the acrobatic maneuver in the air, and landing, all this is part of a ritual. This is one way of proving yourself as entering adulthood, particularly for the male. And here you can see that animation. It is a continuous narrative wherein we have one person here holding the horns of the bull. And the idea was that this person's going to jump off and somersault, as you are seeing here. And then, of course, land on 2 feet. So it's pretty much like the modern gymnastics that we know. But it is very lively, and the entire fresco is heavily decorated with patterns. And you can see the framing here, as well as the different textures and colors that they used for the bands. Again, alternating between white, browns, blacks, and blues. But let's point out the original pieces or fragments versus the reconstruction. This darker blues here, those spots that you see here, those are the original fragments. This lighter color here, all this are the reconstruction. So definitely it's a very hard labor, but we do enjoy the final product of putting this together. Here is a detail of that, and you can see the figure on the left with an almost triangle kind of torso with very thin waist, holding the horns of the bull, and about to jump in somersault. And you can see the very funny eye of the bull looking up, perhaps not knowing what's happening. And in this particular detail, you can see clearly the original fragments versus what we would find as the sort of missing pieces that's just painted light blue here. Although this is not in the Palace of Knossos, this landscape with swallows or spring fresco exemplifies the painting in this area during that time. It was found in room Delta 2 in Akrotiri, Thera. It captures the freshness and vitality of the Aegean world because nature is the sole subject. It captures the essence of the landscape, not its realism, but its expression of joy in the surroundings. And you will see the undulating and vividly colored rocks, graceful lilies swaying in the cool island breezes, and the darting swallows expressing the vigor of growth. Here we find the Minoan's love for nature. It is very lyrical with a curving line, and the artist celebrates the rhythms of spring. And there is an indication of this joy and peace and the sort of animation that we find here. So, this landscape with swallows, and you can see the swallows flying above the sort of rock formation in this particular color is a very, very fresh addition to our knowledge about Minoan art. In this island of Akrotiri, we also find another wall painting, and it's the crocus gatherers. And you can see the similar color compositions, the undulating rock formation, and showing the women. And the women actually are very prominent in Minoan culture here. They occupy a very sort of equal footing with the men. And there's a lot to be said about women, which we will discuss shortly. We have noted the importance of the sea. Here is a painting, again, a fresco of a flotilla, a detail of a miniature ship fresco, and it was found in Akrotiri. This fresco formed a frieze about 17 inches high at the top, and it shows a great fleet sailing from one Aegean port heading for another. Now, it is interesting to note that dolphins frolic about the ships, and on the left shore, a lion pursues a fleeting deer. The port is encircled by a river representing as arching above, and it has quays, houses, and streets filled with attendants to the coming and going of the ships. This detail of the movement of the ships and people does not appear again until Trajan's column 2,000 years later. Now, besides architecture and fresco, pottery was also produced. And here we have the Camarus ware jar from Phaistos in Greece. The Camarus ware is named after the cave on the slope of Mount Ida, where they were first discovered, and many vessels were later found at Phaistos and Knossos. This particular one depicts the love of nature of the Minoans. The sea is definitely the motif, and you can see these undulating lines at the very bottom. The potters made sure that they painted this, and in addition to those undulating lines, the wave. So there is a very interesting pattern, a decorative pattern from the top to the base. But more importantly, besides this, they actually put the central motif here. And you can see that the creamy white and reddish brown decoration is set against a rich black background. The leaping fish, a forerunner of the diving dolphins in the late Minoan and late Cycladic murals, and a fishnet surrounded by a host of curvilinear abstract patterns, including waves and spirals, make this an exquisite work of art. And so, interestingly, the shape of this Camara's jar somehow echoes with this abstract curving designs that we find here. And this also creates a unified composition with the fish and the net. Here we have the marine-style octopus jar from Palakastro in Crete, and it's made of clay dating back to 1500 BCE and is approximately 1 foot and 1 inch high. It's contemporary with the new palace of Knossos, and it features sea creatures, particularly the octopus. And the octopus is the central motif here, and you can see the head with the big eyes. And from this particular position, all his tentacles are actually going around this sort of round shaped particular jar. And it's creating a rhythm, the rhythm of this sort of curving lines and waves mimic the sort of shape of the jar as well as the handle. Now, the artist only used muted tones and then reversed the scheme using the dark silhouettes on light background. This particular painting style remained the norm for 1,000 years until 530 BCE, when light figures on dark background emerged again. But this is a very delightful example. Again, the artist is able to solve the problem to create a unified composition between the form and the subject, between the form and the content. So an octopus that is round with a lot of tentacles can actually occupy all the spaces of this round jar, the marine style octopus jar. Paintings continued and appeared, and in this particular example on a sarcophagus found in Hagia Triada in Crete, and it's made of limestone, approximately 4 feet 6 inch long. This painting is closely related in technique, color scheme, and figure style to contemporary palace frescoes, but the subject is foreign to this place. The painting is about funerary rites of the dead. The dead man, which you see here, appears upright in front of his own tomb and watches as the three men, which you see here, with their dark flesh tone, bring offerings to him. Two light-skinned women, which you see here, carry vessels and pour libation to the deceased, while a male musician plays a lyre. So here we have an instance where death, or the belief in death and burial, etc., is represented. But beyond this narrative that we see here framed are patterns again, flower motifs in various colors, bands in alternating colors, and just like the other abstract motifs or organic motifs that we saw in the Camara's um, jar, we find here this sort of wave-like designs mimicking the sea. Again, the Minoans' love for nature is still represented even in a sarcophagus, which is a container, a burial vessel. Another example is a pottery called the Harvester vase from Hagia Triada, circa 1500 BCE. This time is not made of clay but steatite and has a diameter of 5 inches. Now, when you look at this, it has a band with a sort of sculptural relief. In a sense, it is an image of joyful farmers, and they are processing, if you will, from left to right. And if you look closely on the detail that is on the egg-shaped body and neck of this vessel, we can see that there is a scene of sowing and harvestings. These are the staples of Egyptian funerary art, but the Minoan artist shunned static representation, and so he showed a riotous crowd singing and shouting as they go about their work in the fields. And this forward movement and exuberance of their youth energizes the person viewing this particular vase. The central profile figure with rattle has lungs full, if you will, of air, as seen in his torso. This harvester vase is a first example of showing a keen interest in underlying muscular and skeletal structure of the human body. More important, it shows the joy, the abundance, and even the peace that surrounded Minoan life. The Minoans were exuberant as well as exuded peaceful ways. No wonder this is reflected in the colorful and the sort of joyful representations we've seen thus far. Here is a snake goddess, or so many believe, from the palace at Knossos in Crete. This is made of faience, which is a glazed earthenware, and it is a statuette, and it was found in the palace of Knossos. Now, scholars think they might be a deity, maybe fertility, as we've seen before, or maybe a mortal attendant. The woman is holding snakes in her hands with a leopard like feline on her head. And she appears to us on a frontal pose reminiscent of Egyptian sculpture. What is interesting, besides the details, are actually her face with wide open eyes staring at you, as well as an open bodies exposing her breast. And then we have an apron-like robe and flounce skirt. This contributes to our knowledge of the women in Minoan culture. Whether this is a goddess or a mortal, we have an indication of how women dressed and maybe how women were treated. They were comfortable and bold enough to dress with an open bodies, very confident in their sexuality, as well as interested in a very decorative kind of wear. She is fearless, holding snakes, and perhaps her eyes that are wide open would continue to baffle many and might be linked later to the myth in Greek culture of the Greek Gorgons. One of them we will meet later, and her name is Medusa. Here is another image showing us how women looked back then in the Minoan culture, with a very interesting headdress with sort of wave-like design and long curly hair braided, open bodies, and the flounce skirt. Now, what happens to the Minoans? In 1628 BCE, a volcano in ancient Thera, now Santorini, which is a very famous tourist destination, erupted. By 1500 BCE, the demise of the Minoans was inevitable. By 1450 BCE, the Mycenaeans, another group coming from mainland Greece, took over Crete and the remainder of Minoan life and culture. Here you can see the volcano erupting in ancient Thera, and this created ripple effects. It spewed out dust and other debris affecting the neighboring islands. And of course, some of the islands couldn't recover from this catastrophic event. Even Crete suffered here because the end of its island actually dipped a little bit and was submerged in water. So here is a very interesting event in 1628 BCE, bringing an end to the Minoan culture and civilization. Of course, nothing is absolute, and we will meet another group coming into the picture. A new category, Mycenaean art, circa 2000 to 1200 BCE. Let's talk about the Mycenaeans. In 750 BCE, Homer's epic poem Iliad describes the might and splendor of the Greek armies, poised before the walls of Troy, the first great work of the Greek literature. Many thought it was fiction and that the prehistory of Greece in the Bronze Age was shadowy and lost in an impenetrable world of myth. However, we know that the Mycenaeans have fascinated many archaeologists, and many followed Homer's Iliad as a sort of literary map to find this place and this people. How do we learn more about the Mycenaeans? Well, King Agamemnon of Mycenae is linked to this. Mycenae was described in Homer's work as a place rich with gold. The Mycenaeans appeared on Crete around 2000 BCE. By 1500 BCE, a distinctive Mycenaean culture emerged on Crete. And we have someone to thank for this very interesting discovery. His name is Heinrich Schliemann, and he was a wealthy German businessman turned archaeologist, although some people didn't admire him. And he wanted to prove what the myth was about and try to discover the parallel reality to that. So between 1870 and 1890, he uncovered some of the very cities Homer named. And this was quite an astonishing find. He also excavated Mycenae on the Greek mainland, where he believed King Agamemnon, or Menelaus's brother, once ruled. Here, Schliemann found a massive fortress palace, elaborate tombs, and quantities of old jewelry, masks, cups, and inlaid weapons. Could he have found King Agamemnon's Mycenae, that place rich with gold? Perhaps. The destruction of the palaces in Crete left the Greek mainland culture supreme, and the large citadels built by the Mycenaeans at various locations, including at Tiryns, shows us the best preserved and most impressive ones. They built this around 1400 BCE, and eventually they were burned down around 1250 and 1200 BCE by some believed northern invaders. Here is an aerial view of the citadel at Tiryns. Tiryns is located 10 miles from Mycenae. In Homer's work, he actually documented Tiryns and its great walls. A 2nd century BCE guidebook to Greece, written by the author Pausanias, noted the towering fortifications and considered the walls as spectacular as Egypt. Many Greeks attributed its building to the mythical Cyclopes, a race of one-eyed giants. As you can see in the aerial view, the Mycenaean architecture is very different from the ones we've seen. Ignoring the modern roads, we can see here a sort of outline of that particular citadel. But the most prominent feature of this citadel are the thick walls. And here you can see that they are not just thick, but high, and they circle this area. Some actually think that this is a shape of a pork chop. And so sometimes when we see an aerial view of this citadel, we can definitely spot it without a problem. Why would the Mycenaeans build a citadel in Tiryns with heavy fortifications? Does that indicate to you that they are afraid of invaders, that they might be more engaged in military campaigns, or that they could be warlike in contrast to the Minoans? That's up for us to see through the other works of art. As I've said, the heavy walls of the Mycenaeans contrast with the Cretan palaces. The walls were 20 feet in thickness, and in one section they housed a long gallery covered by a corbelled vault, which you see here. Builders piled the large, irregular cyclopean blocks on horizontal courses and then cantilevered them inward until the two walls met in a pointed arch, which you see here. The most interesting feature of this gallery was the fact that no mortar was used, and the vault is held in place only by the weight of the blocks, each weighing several tons, and by the smaller stones used as wedges and the clay that fills the empty space. The corbelled arch which you see here is just one of the ways of spanning a passageway, and this corbelled arch appears in the gallery in the citadel at Tiryns built by the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans adopted what we call the Cyclopean masonry after the Cyclops, those sort of one-eyed giants, because they believe that no humans can actually do this, because we are dealing with large blocks of stones weighing tons, and they were put in such a way that no mortar was used, only smaller stones to wedge them in place. And they still stand, as you can see in this photograph. So they think that this form of Cyclopean masonry was not built by humans. Of course, this adds more to the legend that we have. Cyclopean masonry looks very primitive, but also massive, and it deterred the would-be attackers of Tiryns because they would have to approach the palace within the thick walls via a long ramp that forced the soldiers to expose their unshielded sides to the Mycenaeans above. So there's a lot of interesting aspects to this architecture, not just the fortified and thick walls, but also the method of masonry. As I've said, this sort of aerial view translated into a floor plan, you can see that the main gate is located on the upper right. So if attackers would approach the citadel at Tyrants, they would have to go through this narrow passage and enter a much narrower passages. And they will be trapped because the Mycenaeans would be pouring various things on top of them. Um, Hitting them with their arrows before they could even make it inside. And the inside is very interesting because it includes a megaron or a reception hall for the king, which is the most important element in the palace plan at this citadel at Tyrings. The main room of the megaron had a throne against the right wall, and it was bordered by four Minoan style wooden columns serving as roof supports. Again, the Minoan culture has been adapted already by the Mycenaeans, and that's why they make an appearance here. So the variation of this plan formed the plan of the early Greek temples and suggests architectural continuity during the so-called Dark Ages that is to come, when the Mycenaean civilization itself collapsed. Besides the citadel at Tiryns, the Mycenaeans also built other architectural structure. And this one is in Mycenae in mainland Greece, made of limestone. And we can see here a lion gate. Above the post and lintel is a sort of heraldic figure with two lions stepping on a platform, and it shows a column very much like the Minoan column, at least with a big sort of capital tapering into a very narrow base. Now, this is a fortress palace, and it is very consistent with what we've seen with the other monuments, architectural monuments of the Mycenaeans. But this sculpture here is also very interesting because it's placed as a gate. And we've seen in other cultures, including the Hittites, the monstrous guardian figures at the entrance to palaces, tombs, and sacred places. And this means that these lions, which are fashioned separately of another material instead of limestone, is actually performing the apotropaic function. And so we see that in various culture, this method of scaring intruders, invaders, trespassers is very consistent. But again, here we appreciate a much sort of um, regular stone, larger still, that are used to build this fortified passageway that is marked by the lion gate in this particular photograph. Here is a treasury of Atreus, the beehive vault of the Tholos at Mycenae in mainland Greece, dating to circa 1300 BCE. It is 43 feet high. Wealthy Mycenaeans were laid to rest outside the citadel walls. And here is a beehive shaped Tholos covered by an enormous earthen mound, which you see here. The treasury of Atreus is the best preserved Tholos tomb, called so because it was mistaken to be the repository of the treasure of Atreus, known as the father of Agamemnon and Menelaus. You can approach the Tholos tomb through a long passageway, and the tomb chamber is inside once you enter the doorway, made of two posts and a lintel, which relieves the triangle above it. Here is that same genealogy I showed you before when we looked at the Minoans, but this time I wanted to point out Atreus, I wanted to point out Agamemnon, and I wanted to point out Menelaus, because these are the names that we now associate with the Mycenaeans. Back to the treasury of Atreus, or the beehive vault shaped in this tholos, we can see that it is composed of a series of stone corbelled courses laid on a circular base and ending in a lofty dome. The dome is more complicated than a vault. This is the largest known vaulted space without interior supports that had ever been built until the Romans constructed the Pantheon 1,500 years later using a new technology, which is concrete. And concrete, of course, was unknown to Mycenaeans. So when you look at this particular drawings, you can see from an aerial view the dromos, or the passageway, and you enter the doorway and you find yourself in the round-shaped tholos. And the tholos is looking like this from the inside, and it's vaulted but without additional support. So it's a very, very intriguing construction for a particular so-called treasury of Atreus. Besides architecture, we find Mycenaean metalwork, sculpture, and painting. And in Grave Circle A, we see a bit of this. This grave circle A predates the Lion Gate and the walls of Mycenae by 3 centuries. It is a royal burial complex with 6 deep shafts that serves as tombs for kings and their families. The Mycenaeans lay their dead on the floors of these shaft graves with masks bearing their faces, recalling the similarity with Egyptian funerary practice, like the mask of King Tutankhamun. So the Mycenaeans buried their women with their jewelry and men with their weapons and golden cups. Here is an example of one of the objects, which is the funerary mask from Grave Circle A. As you can see, it is made of beaten gold. The technique used is what we call repoussé, Repousse, repoussé. The treatment of the face is more primitive in this mask. It was the first known attempt in Greece to render the human face as life-size, not monumental size, as we've seen in Egypt. For example, Ramses II's colossal statues in Abu Simbel. It is not clear if the mask was intended to serve as a portrait, but the goldsmiths recorded different physical types with care, portraying the youth, portraying the old, some with beard, as you can see here. So clearly, the Mycenaeans tried to create a variety. And also, it indicates, because of the material, that they were quite rich because they possess gold. So here we find a very symmetrical piece. Again, what's on the left side is also on the right side. We find a very irregularly placed ear, but we also see the eyebrows and the eyes that are closed, very thin nose, and the mustache and closed lip. And then, of course, the beard. Now, repousse is a technique that we've already discussed when we look at the Sasanian silver portrait. It is beating a sheet of metal, in this case gold, to create or arrive at the shapes that you find here. So raising that shapes to produce the details that mimic a face. As we've said, Mycenaean men were buried with their weapons and gold cups, in addition to the face mask. Here is an example of that object, a dagger, blade with lion hunt, um, if you will, represented. This was found in the grave circle A in Mycenae, and there is a bronze inlaid with gold, silver, and yellow. And here we see yellow as a black metallic alloy. On this side, we see four hunters attacking a lion that has struck down a fifth hunter while two other lions flee. So here's one, second, third, fourth, and of course another one. And here's the lion, of course, another one, and another one. When you look at the actual figure here, you could see that the man represented has a triangular torso with a very thin waist. This is very similar with the Minoan figures that we've seen. And so there is a transference of visual representation, perhaps, the visual repertoire that we've seen before in the Minoan culture, because nothing completely disappears. So here we see that the figures are standing almost tall because this is the widest part of the dagger. And as the dagger tapers, the composition also dips a little bit. And so here we find somebody almost in a kneeling position, charging. The lion's head is raised, but the legs extend until, of course, everything shrinks to the very tip of the dagger. So from the slim-waisted, long-haired figures, which are very Minoan in style, to the very end, we can see that the artist is trying to fit certain subjects, but also that the artist has been influenced by the Minoan culture because Mycenaeans greatly admired Minoan art and were patrons of Minoan art. So perhaps they also absorbed this and tried to make sure that the style was followed. Again, a wonderful presentation using various metals to present a very interesting battle between men and lions. And here is an example of a gold cup, which would have been buried with the deceased, a male deceased, featuring a hunter capturing a bull. Here is a female head from Mycenae in mainland Greece made of painted plaster. It gives us a view of Mycenaean sculpture and painting. The woman has white flesh tone and red paint on her cheeks and forehead and chin. This might symbolize vitality, if you will. We are recalling the facial paint or traces of paints and even tattoos recorded on early Cycladic figurines of women. Her eyes are staring like a guardian figure. Maybe she has a performance of an apotropaic function. The closest parallel to this work are the terracotta images of goddesses from Mycenaean shrines. And so we appreciate this very delightful face, despite the ambiguity in its identity. The last object we are to examine is this warrior vase from Mycenae, circa 1200 BCE and approximately 1 foot 4 inch high. It is a crater or a bowl for mixing wine and water. It is one of the art forms that did not continue throughout the period after the downfall of the Mycenaean palace. It shows a frieze of warriors marching to battle, and we are looking at this ground line, the band, and we can see this soldier right here, and the rest moving towards the left direction. And we find a woman at the very far left corner, actually with a hand arm raised, waving, bidding them farewell because they might not return. Clearly, the scene of war or the battle before it began is shown here through this lineup of soldiers, again with those shields that we already saw in the dagger. They are shown in profile with very pointed noses, carrying spears, and helmeted. There is no setting and it lacks landscape, but we can see that in contrast to the Minoans, the Mycenaeans shows a military-like, a warlike kind of lifestyle. And so the simplification of narrative gives even more power to the reality that is to come. The, the Mycenaeans, from their fortified citadel to the warrior vase. Just like the demise of the Minoans because of a cataclysmic event, by 1200 BCE, the Mycenaean palaces were destroyed, and Greece was plunged into what we call the Dark Age, when the arts of painting, carving, building, and even writing almost disappeared. The historical Greeks look back on the achievement of their Minoan and Mycenaean predecessors with awe, but in time will eventually surpass them. So here is a lesson from the Cycladic to the Minoans to the Mycenaeans, inhabiting the Aegean Sea, whether from the islands in the Cyclades or Crete or the mainland like Mycenae or Tiryns. So here is a summary using a map of where we have been. The Cyclades over here, Crete over here, and of course mainland Greece. Here we found the marble figurines. Here we found the woman holding the snakes and the bull leaping fresco. Also the various potteries and the lion gate of Mycenae, as well as the cups made of gold. They had greatly contributed to this Aegean world, and we are now moving forward to the most exciting period, the Greeks in ancient times.